but descendants of slaves got nothing. I believe it is reasonable for descendants of slaves to get crown lands. And I'm saying get crown lands in the same way that plantation owners got it. And this was what Operation Pride was about.
There's an important historical truth that Miss Sutherland makes. But historical injustice is not the same thing as present day entitlement. It matters that we have history, but the fact that history explains part of our inequality does not automatically tell us what Jamaica should do today. And this is where I think Miss Duncan Sutherland's argument becomes a little weak. Let's imagine your grandfather was robbed. His farm was taken. His children grew up poor because of it. That is injustice. But 100 years later, what exactly is justice? Is justice simply finding another farm and giving it to you? Or is justice creating a society in which you and your children have the education, the capital, the skills, the credit to, the opportunity to acquire and create wealth for yourselves? There are two different visions for Jamaica, you know. One pursued by wholeness, which is what I've just described. The other is what you heard from Duncan Sutherland. And those are two different ideas of emancipation. One says, give me an asset. The other says, give me the capacity to create assets. And I believe Jamaica needs to be much more ambitious than simply redistributing land. And this is where the economic question becomes critical. You know, there is a famous proposition in political economy that says essentially that the way human beings organize themselves to produce the means of their subsistence forms the foundation of society. How men organize to produce the means of their subsistence constitutes the fundamentals of society. And that's the point I want to bring into Cooper's pen. Because a society cannot become prosperous simply by redistributing what already exists. At some point, we have to produce. We have to grow food, we have to build houses, create businesses, manufacture, export, drive and develop technology, educate, invent, invest, create capital. That is what Singapore did. Because if we don't increase production, we eventually end up fighting over the distribution of a very small pie. And that is my concern with the political conversation around Cooper's Pen. We are talking endlessly about who should get land, but we are not talking about what will those people do with the land. Suppose the government gives 10,000 Jamaicans a piece of land, as Miss Duncan Sutherland is suggesting, one eighth of an acre. Wonderful. But what happens next? The people need roads, water, electricity, schools, credit, technical knowledge, equipment, markets, title, insurance. And they also need an economy that allows that land to generate income. Otherwise, what have we done? We may have transformed or we may have transferred an asset without creating productive capacity. We can't distribute land without necessarily creating wealth. It's wealth we have to create. Because that's not emancipation. That is potentially just another form of dependency. And this is what I don't like with the thinking of the PNP. You know, the fishing rod problem. People often say you give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. But if you teach him to fish, you feed him for a life. But even that is not enough. Suppose I teach you to fish. You still need a fishing rod. You still need a boat. You need fuel. You need somewhere to sell the fish. You need a refrigerator. You need roads. You need access to finance. You need a functioning market. That's what economic development does. Listen to the Prime Minister and you'll see the difference. He is creating an ecosystem of production. If you do not create the ecosystem of production, you could distribute land till a morning. The people will remain economically dependent. So when we talk about land reform, I'm not against land reform. I think Jamaica desperately need serious land reform. But land reform must be about ownership, productivity, and economic independence, not merely political distribution, because land is an asset. Now let's bring this back to Cooper's Pen. The tragedy of Cooper's Pen should force Jamaica to confront the land question. But we have to distinguish between land reform and taking somebody else's private property. The Cooper's Pen land was privately owned, and the courts had already made orders concerning the occupation. The PNP later attempted compulsory acquisition as a solution, but that strategy was rejected by the courts. So we need to be extremely careful, because you cannot say these people are poor, therefore they deserve this particular piece of land, because then you have created another problem. Because what happens to the rights of the person who owns it? The answer cannot be that property cancels property right, or the answer cannot be that poverty cannot cancel out property rights, and neither can the answer be that property rights cancel the government's responsibility to address poverty. Both things are true. So what should Jamaica actually do? Let's stop making land reform a political slogan and make it a national economic project. PNP versus JLP. Let's make land reform a national economic project. Right? We must inventory the public land, accelerate land titling, create affordable ownership, invest massively in human capital, because land without education is not enough. If we really want to break the legacy of slavery, then educate the descendants of the enslaved to the highest possible level. Literacy, numeracy, science, technology, engineering, medicine, trades, entrepreneurship, financial literacy. When you do that, you are creating an economy capable of absorbing talents. Because what good is education if the educated person has nowhere productive to use it? Jamaica became independent in 1962. We have now had 64 years of political sovereignty. So I think we need to ask ourselves a difficult question. At what point does history become context rather than destiny? Slavery explains part of where Jamaica started. Colonialism explains part of our institutional inheritance. Land dispossession explains part of our inequality. But if after 64 years of independence, our political philosophy remains because we are poor and because of what our ancestors did, therefore government must compensate us,